And without further ado, Angela Stover with our Patient-Centered Care lecture, Patient-Reported Outcomes in Cancer Care. And Dr. Stover is an assistant professor of health policy and management at UNC Chapel Hill and an associate member of the Lineberger Comprehensive Cancer Center. She also serves as science advisor to the Patient and Family Resource Advisory Council at UNC Health. Dr. Stover has unique experience in using implementation science to integrate patient-reported outcomes into routine cancer care delivery. And prior to her doctoral degree, Dr. Stover served as one of the original developers of the 6 item banks at the National Institute of Health's PROMISE initiative while she was at the University of Pittsburgh. All right, Dr. Stover, welcome. I should ask, tell us, in addition to your professional resume, what's one thing we should know about you that is more of a hobby or special interest?
Well, I grew up in Pittsburgh, so I'm a big Steelers fan. And then I moved to North Carolina 10 years ago, and now I'm a Tar Heels fan too. Great.
Good for you. All right. Well, I mentioned we'd be using poll everywhere, and here's the first question. Have you used patient-reported outcomes in your clinic, either paper or electronic? And yes, no, or not sure. And you can go ahead and respond to that, and then we'll look at the answers in a moment. And while we're doing that, I do have to go over the disclosures. So this activity has been planned and implemented under the sole supervision of the course directors in association with the UNC Office of Continuing Professional Development. William A. Wood, MD, MPH, and CPD staff have no financial relationships with commercial interests as defined by the ACCME. Angela M. Stover, PhD, has no financial relationships with commercial interests as defined by the ACCME. All right, let's take a look at that poll. We've got a broad variety of responses here. We're actually almost even with all 3 of these. Let's take another 10-15 seconds. So have you used patient-reported outcomes in your clinic, either paper or electronic? And you can put A if you're using the texting for yes, B for no, or C for not sure. And of course, there's no right answer here, but this gives us a little bit of a sense of your background with patient-reported outcomes. Dr. Stover, anything you want to say about these initial responses?
Thank you for answering. Yeah, this is great. So almost half of you have experience with it, which is really helpful.
Great. And we already have 120 people in our Zoom audience in addition to all of our sites. So really thrilled to have so many people here. And let me just, there we go. Patient-reported outcomes in cancer care with Angela M. Stover, PhD. And I'll turn it over to you. Just let me know when you would like me to advance those slides.
Thank you, Tim. Let's advance to the objectives. Can you go back 2 slides?
2 slides. Going too quickly. There we go. We jumped over it. Sorry about that.
Thank you. That's okay. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about patient-reported outcomes and work we're doing at UNC and across the globe. So the learning objectives today are to describe what PROs are and how they're used in cancer care. And I'm going to describe clinical outcomes that PROs can improve when they're completed at home by patients. We call that remotely outside the clinic. And then patients can also fill these out in clinic, in the waiting room. And I'm going to talk to you about some evidence that we have for that. And then at the end, I want to discuss an application of PROs via an implementation case study here at the North Carolina Cancer Hospital in Chapel Hill, because I'm frequently asked about how clinics can implement PROs. So next slide. And one more. Okay, so thank you for being here with all the craziness that's going on with COVID-19. This has become a really timely topic. This is a paper that was just published online last month. I'm seeing a lot of these pop up now where since clinics have had to pivot to telehealth and phone calls to take care of our cancer patients, I've seen a lot more calls now that PROs, which are symptom questionnaires, could be really helpful in that. So this has become really timely, even though we scheduled this 9 or 10 months ago. Next slide. So let's just start with a definition, because it sounds like half of you are familiar, so let's all get on the same page. So the FDA defines a PRO as measurement based on a report that comes directly from the patient about their own health condition or health status without amendment or interpretation of the patient's response. And I have that last clause highlighted there in yellow because it's really important to what a PRO is. So this is a patient reports on their own health status. But let's say you're a clinician and you're asking your patient to rate their pain on a 1 to 10 scale, where 10 is the worst. And the patient says 6. And the clinician writes down moderate pain. That's not a PRO anymore because it's been interpreted. So 6 might actually be very severe to someone. So you want to make sure with a PRO that it's recorded exactly as the patient intended. Next slide. So let's go over some examples. So I have a little cartoon here of a guy who's having a lot of symptoms, and these are a lot of the symptoms that we see in cancer care. Pain, fatigue, fever, coughing, dyspnea, sore throat. So all of these can be captured with a PRO. PROs are also symptoms. Functional status is physical function, quality of life, and even things like self-efficacy for managing their condition can be captured with a PRO. And then below that, I have experience measures, which we call PREMs, which are like satisfaction with care. You may be familiar with HCAHPS, for instance, or the Press-Ganey scores that come back. So today, I'm not going to be focusing on the satisfaction with care. That's a different field. So I'm going to be focusing today on PROs, which are the symptom questionnaires. Next slide. So these are some examples of some really common items. So usually what you see with a PRO is at the top it says, please think back over the past 7 days. So usually people are given some kind of time frame to rate their symptoms. And then the first question says, how often did you have arm or leg swelling? This could be related to lymphedema, for instance. So never, rarely, occasionally, frequently, or almost constantly. And this particular patient marked frequently, so they'd be given the next 2 items. The next one asks about the severity of their swelling, and the third one asks about how much it interferes with their usual or daily activities. And these are really common to ask about how often a symptom occurs, how severe is it, and does it interfere with function, daily activities, things that people need to be doing every day. Next slide. So you may have seen this. These are PHQ-9 items. That stands for the Patient Health Questionnaire 9. Sometimes we usually PHQ-2 as well. You may have seen that in your clinic. And this is a depression measure to get at depression and anxiety that people may be feeling when they're coming into the clinic. So the first 2 items are little interest or pleasure in doing things, feeling down, depressed, or hopeless. And then there are response choices for not at all, several days, more than half the days, or nearly every day. Next slide. So what I'm getting at today, though, is more of the application of these PROs. How can we use them in cancer care? So on the right-hand side, there are 4 ways that we generally use these in cancer care. So the first one is direct patient care at the point of care. Patients can fill out depression questionnaires, for instance, in the waiting room, and then the clinician reviews it with them to inform symptom management. We also use it in comparative effectiveness research, which is CER, and PCOR is patient-centered outcomes research, which is what I do. And these are health services researchers. We can compare drug A to drug B for depression, for instance, in cancer, and then the outcome variable could be their self-reported depression and anxiety symptoms. The third one down is quality assessment. This is a newer idea for PROs. Usually it's those experience measures of satisfaction with care, but internationally PROs are used for quality assessment. And here at UNC we ran a 6-site study where we developed PRO-based performance metrics, and then tested them in 6 cancer centers across the United States. And these are also in the oncology first care model that was proposed by CMS and various other places. So these are probably maybe 8 to 10 years out for us. And then in decision making, this can be used, if patients come in, you probably have heard this where they ask, well, what do patients like me, how do they feel, how do they do, what symptoms do they have? So this can be used in decision making to help people make choices between surgery, chemotherapy, mastectomy, if it's breast cancer, and various other treatment types. Next slide. And, you know, one common thing that I've asked is, you know, why are PROs, why do they work? Why are they important? I have had many conversations with colleagues and at conferences, and they're genuinely curious about how this works because what they frequently say is that I talk to my patients about their symptoms. Of course I know what their symptoms are. And there are 2 pieces to the puzzle that I'm going to tell you about now that why PROs are important. Clinical intuition is obviously important, but this is an add-on to help communication. So this slide is showing a study that was published in New England Journal of Medicine. These are 6 common symptoms that you would see in cancer care. Fatigue, anorexia would be like loss of weight, GI symptoms, nausea, vomiting. And these are, what happened is these were 700 cancer patients. So they came in for their visit, and right after the visit, the patient and the clinician were both given a questionnaire and asked to rate the patient's symptoms from that day. So from that visit, how's the patient doing? And then that happened over, multiple months. So you can see this is happening over time. In orange are the patient-reported responses, and in blue are the clinician-reported responses. And you can see that in every one of these, clinicians were underreporting what the patients were feeling in that direct visit. And some of these are actually pretty far apart, and the ones that are about perception are the most far. So fatigue, for instance, is a perception. Vomiting otherwise is pretty close. So if somebody came in and they said, I threw up 3 times yesterday, that's pretty objective, right? So I'd imagine that one would be closer, but any of these other ones that are perceptions are pretty far apart. Those lines never cross. And it doesn't seem to get better over time. So one argument I hear is, okay, well, they didn't know the patient in that first one. There you go, thank you for slides, that they didn't know it, but it doesn't seem to the lines don't get any closer over time. Next slide. And here's the second piece of the puzzle. I don't have to tell you how short cancer visits are, but what surprises people is how long patients have to talk. So this was published last year, and what they did is they analyzed recorded consultations. So about half of them were primary care visits and half were specialty care like oncology. It was over 100 patients and over 60 physicians over a 7-year time period. And the median encounter time was 30 minutes, and it ranged from 40 to 80 minutes. And what they did is they literally clocked it, how long patients had to talk at the beginning about their symptoms before they were interrupted by a care team member. Next slide. Tim, would you like to do the honor?
Absolutely. So here we go. And our question is, how long do patients have to talk before they are interrupted by a care team member? And so answer A would be less than 1 minute, B would be 1 minute, C would be 2 minutes, and D would be 3 or more minutes. So again, this is all anonymous, so go ahead and put what you either know or put your best guess, and we'll take about 10 more seconds to give you a chance to respond, and then find out from Dr. Stover how you did. I don't know for certain, but I've got a pretty good guess on this one, I think. All right, Dr. Stover, we're trending with less than a minute. That doesn't seem like much time. What is the actual answer?
Yeah, if you go to the next slide, we can take a look at that. You're right. So it's actually 11 seconds. I was pretty shocked about how long that is, and the range is 7 to 22 seconds. So if you think about how short of a time period 11 seconds is, we're all patients at one point in time, for something. If I had to go in and explain symptoms, especially something as complex as cancer, and I only had 11 seconds, I don't think I could do it. I could maybe talk about one or two, but there's no way I could talk about everything that was happening. So some are going to get pushed to the side, and then only the most severe are going to be mentioned by the patient. So next slide. Given these two pieces of the puzzle, that short visit times, patients don't have a lot of time to talk to us about what their symptoms are, and the perception between clinicians and patients on the same day about the level of symptoms has made a lot of health systems interested in PROs. So again, this was New England Journal of Medicine, and they did a survey of all their readers for why health systems are interested in PROs, why are they using them, and the top three were improve patient experience, improve quality metrics, or improve patient engagement. And then there were some other ones, and these were over 600 responses from folks. Next slide. And then, they asked, does your organization actually use PROs with patients? And over half said that they were either yes or they plan to do that in the next 3 years. And this was published last year. So over half, which was surprising to me. Only 17% said no, and they don't have any plans to do so. And then about a third didn't know, which is fair. Next slide. So of only the hospital systems that were already using PROs, they asked, is it worth it to implement this? And half said yes, only 13% said no, and about 38% said don't know. And they were able to fill in after this, what they were thinking about when they wrote for don't know. And in most cases, what this was is that they hadn't been using them long enough to determine whether there was a benefit or not. So I suspect the yes is going to just keep increasing over time for healthcare systems. Next slide.
All right. And so for this one, what cancer clinical outcomes can patient-reported outcomes improve? And A is symptom burden and quality of life. B is survival. C is emergency room rates. D is patient satisfaction with care. And E is all of the above. And already in these first few seconds, we seem to be trending with one particular answer. But we'll wait about 10 more seconds and give you an opportunity to respond. Again, it's anonymous. Please do respond with your best guess. So again, A, symptom burden and quality of life. B, survival. C, emergency room rates. D, patient satisfaction with care. And E, all of the above. That would be pretty impressive if it were E. Dr. Stover, how are they doing?
They are amazing. It is E. And I'm going to go over that evidence now to show you what the research says about all that. And this audience is incredibly informed. I never get that many reporting E. So good job. So this is, now I'm going to go over the evidence for those outside the clinic and in the clinic. How do PROs improve outcomes is, one of the questions that I get a lot. So I came up with this diagram to try to show people what's happening. So all the way on the left are ePROs, and the E just means it's electronic, like filled out on the computer, a laptop, or phone. And then what happens is that it enhances symptom detection. So those visits are so short, and they have 11 seconds. So you're going to enhance symptom detection. And then when we talk to clinicians afterward about what they've found when they were using the PROs, is that it also enhanced the patient-centered communication about symptom management. So they tell us that they didn't need to spend their time eliciting all those symptoms, like going through a big checklist, like do you have pain, do you have nausea, do you have everything. They already knew that, so they could hone in on exactly the pieces that were a problem, like, wow, your nausea score is really high, we really need to look at that, for instance. So it changed the tone of the conversation and the content of the conversation. And when you work through both of those, then you get better symptom control, which leads to all the, nice outcomes that we're hoping for. Decreased symptom burden and ER visits, better survival, quality of life, physical function. And then patient satisfaction with care has its own box at the bottom because we know that's related directly also through communication and through better symptom control. Next slide. And next slide. So this is some of the evidence that is out there for survival and emergency room rates. So there was a PRO trial at Memorial Sloan Kettering. This was done by Ethan Bash, who is the director of the Cancer Outcomes Research Program here at UNC in Lineberger. But at the time, he was at Memorial Sloan Kettering. And he did a randomized trial with chemotherapy patients, and they were randomized to usual care, just whatever care that they would normally get, or they filled out PROs weekly at home. And then if they reported severe or worsening symptoms, an alert went to their clinician that said, hey, your person's really scoring pretty high, you consider giving them a call. And what they found is that the intervention group, who was in more contact with their team about symptoms, they were able to remain on chemotherapy 2 months longer. And they were also more likely to be alive at 1 and 5 years, and all the years in between actually too. And they were less likely to visit the emergency room. So these were all very good outcomes, but it was only at one center. So next slide. So this is the survival data, and don't panic. You don't need to understand statistics in any way to see that survival is better in the blue line group, which is the PRO group, versus control group, which is usual care. So I'll walk you through this graph real quick. So on the horizontal axis at the bottom, this is at each month the number of people alive are recorded. And then I have a big red box around 0 to 12 months because that's when the people filled out the PROs at home weekly. And then on the vertical axis, that's the probability of survival. So if you look at 1.0, when we start at the beginning of the study, everyone's alive. Unfortunately, people pass away. So as they pass away, these lines start decreasing. And as I think they start to become significant at 6 months, and then the lines just keep getting farther and farther apart, which means the PRO group is surviving longer than the usual care group. Next slide. So while this was a really great study, Ethan and I wanted to look at this in community oncology practices. So we are looking to see if these results generalize to 52 community oncology practices across the U.S. I think it's in 26 states. So we've enrolled 1,197 patients. We actually had to stop enrollment for the last 3 for COVID. We might be able to pick them up later. And all patients are receiving chemotherapy, and we follow them for up to 12 months. And it's the same design where patients are randomized to usual care, or they're randomized to complete these PROs at home weekly. And I'm saying that the patients are randomized, but in this one, it's actually what we call cluster randomized, which means each practice is randomized to usual care or to the PRO trial. So next slide. So this is our map here in the Carolina blue states. Those are the states where we have at least one site, and you can see this is a pretty typical chemotherapy population. It's 58% women, 78% white, about 40% have a high school education or less, and the average age is 62. And you can see that there's a range of different cancer types. And I saw a comment pop up in the chat box asking about specific regimens, and this was open to all chemotherapy regimens. The only one is when they were blinded in a clinical trial and we didn't know like the emetic risk. That was the only exclusion. So we're in the 26 states. So next slide. And these are the symptoms that the patients complete every week and send that in. So pain, GI symptoms, of course, nausea, vomiting, physical function, eating and drinking decreases is what we went with for that. Fatigue, insomnia, dyspnea is trouble breathing, depression, and falls are important in this group. Next slide. And this is the intervention arm. So the patient completes it at home between visits. They can choose to do it on any web-enabled device, so their computer, their laptop, their phone, or they can do it on interactive voice response system, which is they get an automated call on their landline or their cell phone, and they use the keypad on their phone to complete their PRO. So it's kind of like when you call a business and you get you get the menu of things and you have to like press 0 for the operator or something like that. It's just like that, but they fill their PRO out that way. And then if they reported concerning symptoms, an alert went to their clinician and that was automated and went immediately to their designated site and their designated clinician or care team. And then we did not give any ideas about how patients were treated. It's just all clinical intuition and what was best for the patient. They just had to contact the patient within 48 hours. Usually it was the next day, but occasionally it was a weekend, and patients were told ahead of time that it would not be an immediate callback. And then we offered it in English, Spanish, and Mandarin Chinese. Next slide.
All right, and here is our next poll. When given the choice, what percentage of chemotherapy patients choose interactive voice response, automated phone call, to complete weekly PROs at home? And if you think that's 10%, you'll put A, or 20% B, 30% C, 40% D, 50% E. Wow, I feel like we're watching a horse race here, and they're going back and forth. And I have honestly no idea on this one. Take another 5 or 6 seconds for our audience, please. And as always, thank you for getting in there and responding and being a part of this. All right, Dr. Stover, it seems like it's sort of settling out. What is the answer?
We as a team had expected about 20 to 25%, but if you go to the next slide, we can see the answer. It's actually 39%, which was much higher than we thought it was going to be. But this actually matches another chemotherapy trial that offered interactive voice response systems at home. I think they actually were a little over 40%. So this doesn't seem to be an anomaly. Next slide. So when I show this slide, this is broadband access in the United States, and with COVID-19, we've seen the digital divide, so this isn't as surprising anymore, but when I used to present this slide, people were pretty surprised about how much yellow area there is, which means there's no broadband access. Next slide. And here are 26 intervention sites. So you can see that every red dot borders a yellow area, which would be their catchment area for the cancer center. Almost all of those dots do, which means that not all of their folks are going to be able to complete this online, that we had to have some sort of other option that would be phone-based. And paper would not be feasible because it would involve mailing. So this interactive voice response system ended up being critical. Next slide. And then what we did is we went back and looked at, who are the folks that are more likely to choose the interactive voice response? And it's, a lot of our at-risk populations, which probably isn't surprising. So on the vertical axis, these are the percent choosing IVR. in each category. So if you look at age, which are the blue bars, the first one is people who are less than 65 years old versus 65 and older. And the 65 and older range was more likely to pick IVR. And then if you keep moving through, going to the right, it was men, folks who live in a rural area, people of color, and then people without college degrees. So it was most of the groups that we expected. Next slide. And then what we went and took a look at is whether these folks actually had more symptoms, whether they had a higher symptom burden. And they did. It was highly significant. So in the first pie chart, you can see that the interactive voice response folks, of all the problems that they filled out, about 40% of the time an alert went to a nurse or a care team or clinician. But for the folks who chose email, it was only about 26% of the time. Next slide. So now, that was a lot of the evidence for and these big trials for outside the clinic. But another major piece of patient-centered care is what happens in the clinic, in the waiting room. Next slide. So we usually have to look to international data for longer-term data. They're ahead of us in administering PROs in clinics and outside the clinic. This happens to be from Cancer Care Ontario in Canada. They've been administering PROs to their cancer patients for 13 years. And before I was talking about chemotherapy, but these are folks, this is everybody coming through the clinic door, all adults. So it's any kind of treatment type, any cancer type, any stage. And what they did is they matched each cancer patient to who completed PROs to one who didn't complete PROs. And they had 128,000 matched pairs. And the folks who were filling out their PROs in the waiting room, they were 8% less likely to visit the emergency room and 14% less likely to be hospitalized. Now, 8% might not seem like a lot, but if you think about 8% of 128,000 pairs, that's a lot of people, and it's a lot of money to go to the emergency room, at least in the U.S. It's a different payment system in Canada, but here that would be a huge amount of savings, and everyone hates to go to the emergency room, so that would be, patients' preference as well is to not go to the emergency room. Next slide. And a little closer to home here, so this was University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. They have been collecting PROs for quite some time in a bunch of different areas, including cancer, and they have EPIC, just like we do for UNC. And these were portal-based, like patient portal, or office-based tablets, more than 270 clinics. And what they found was a correlation between discussing the PROs and those top box satisfaction scores, like for Press-Ganey. So I'll walk you through this. This was in New England Journal of Medicine Catalyst in 2018, I think. So if you look all the way to the left, these are no PROs completed. So they randomized patients to one of three groups. So it was no PROs, like they just weren't even offered PROs. PROs were completed, but they weren't discussed with the patient, or they were completed and discussed with the patient. So if you go all the way to the left for no PROs completed, it's about 84 and 80% for provider communication, which is green, and shared decision making. This is probably pretty typical. And then if you move, though, to where patients filled out PROs and then no one talked to them about it, the scores remain the same, and as a matter of fact, communication actually went down a point, which is not the way that we want that to go. And then if you look all the way to the right, so if patients filled out PROs in the waiting room and then someone discussed it with them, 94% and 91% were picking that top box satisfaction with care score. So we know that PROs are improving the patient experience as well. Next slide. So I want to spend the last 10 minutes or so here talking about implementation. It's a research area of mine, and I also get asked a lot about how to implement PROs in clinics. So I wanted to spend a little time with you on that. So this is a paper that is going to be coming out in a couple of weeks in the journal called Quality of Life Research. And you can see that my colleagues on this one are also international. Next slide. So what we did is we looked at 4 case studies. So 3 of them were implementing PROMs, and 1 was implementing a experience measure in Western Canada in primary care. But the other ones were a chronic pain network in Eastern Canada, oncology outpatient in Australia, and pediatric and adult health conditions in the Netherlands. Next slide. So all of these sites had implemented PROs separately, so there was no communication ahead of time. But what we did afterward is we did cross-case comparisons in the paper that's coming out. And there were really common PRO barriers. They were remarkably consistent, no matter what care setting or country even, which makes me think that these are probably pretty common for the U.S. as well. Unsure which PROs to use. Of course, I mean, that's an expertise area that most people wouldn't have. Technology limitations of capturing PROs. So in those case studies, whenever PROs were not linked to the electronic health record, the acceptability to clinicians was a lot lower. It was a lot of work to go into a second system and do a different login and not be able to pull those smart phrases out. So that was always a barrier. Uncertain about the ease and the benefits of using PROs, which we can tackle in training sessions. Perceived increase in workload, competing demands with established clinical workflows, and then cost and time to implement. These are pretty universal. Next slide. So some lessons learned from these case studies. These barriers were remarkably consistent across the care setting. So if you're considering implementing PROs for your clinic, look at those barriers and make them into your plan at the beginning, because they're probably going to be a problem. But what was unique about it is that the enablers, like the enabling conditions, were different. So what it was is that every clinic had different resources. So the implementation needed to be tailored to each clinic and its resources, what they had available, and their patients. So in other words, one size is not going to fit all. And the PRO clinic initiatives were more likely to be successful if they had purposely designed integration. And I say that with a grain of salt because they were definitely flying the plane while they were building it. It's just how a lot of implementation and quality improvement works. But they did have a general sense of the direction and purpose that they designed up front. And then substantive engagement with stakeholders, clinicians and patients. This may seem obvious, but so many implementation projects are just done in a top-down manner and don't really consider the needs of the people that are going to be using it. So they were more likely to be successful if they engaged those folks. And then leveraging EHR technology whenever possible helped out. And then clinics evaluating implementation. So they were more likely to, be planning for that evaluation the whole time, and then they were able to go back and say, okay, was this successful for our patients? Is it acceptable and appropriate, or do we need to go back and make some changes? Is there something better we could do with workflow, for instance? And a lot of them did PDSA cycles at the beginning. Next slide. So this was published in British Medical Journal, and I like it just as a graphic to show, that it's a process to implement. There's a bunch of steps. So stakeholder engagement and cooperation, figure out what outcomes you want to measure. Is pain more likely to be in your population, depression, GI symptoms? There are lists out there of standardized core outcome sets, for instance, of things that we should be assessing in each cancer type. And, your local PRO expert can probably help you figure that out. And then selection of PROMs, which have validity and reliability evidence for your population. So we just colleagues of mine just put in a grant, and it was with AYAs to do PROs. And we had to look and find what the evidence was for instance, a cognition measure in adolescent and young adult cancer survivors. We knew what the evidence was in older, but what about younger? And it turns out there was some validity evidence, so we thought that was okay to administer. And then there's usually some kind of integrated approach to electronic capture or IVRS. And then reporting of PROMS data to meet the stakeholder needs. So this is like visualization. So back in the day with Epic, you could send out a PRO through MyChart, but what would come back is just a number with no context. You know, is that good? Is it bad? Should I be worried? So make sure that the visualization has a lot of context and makes sense for your end users, which are your clinicians and your patients. And then, you know, doing some kind of system evaluation at various time points seems to help, you know, help smooth out problems and find the problems, actually. Next slide. Right there. Thank you. These are, ISOQual stands for International Society for Quality of Life Research. It's the premier conference for PROs. If you're interested in hearing more about this, it's a society, an international society. We're actually virtual this year, so it's going to be October 19th through the 23rd. So if you wanted to attend virtually, that'll be open to people, and they've drastically reduced the rates. And I'll be presenting some of this data in Symposium 3 if you want to attend with us. But if you're interested, they also have freely available, free access guides to implementing PROs in clinical practice. So there's a guide, and there's also a companion guide that shows things that, you know, these common barriers and how some case studies overcame those barriers. So the website's listed there. Next slide.
All right, and
Okay.
this is our last question that Dr. Stover has for you, and after that, then it'll be your opportunity to ask her questions. So all patient-reported outcomes are free to use. If you think that's true, give or A, false, B, or don't know, or C. And so the next time we pop up Poll Everywhere, that will be an opportunity for you to be asking questions, so you might want to be jotting those down. And then we'll take as many of your questions as we can at the end. Dr. Stover,
Tim, it also looks like there's a there also looks like there's a few questions in the chat box, but I'm not able to look at those. If you could maybe take a look at those, we could look at them at the end.
Absolutely, yeah. I'll definitely relay as many of the. I think one of them was just a technical troubleshooting issue, but we will encourage our audience as much as possible to relay those questions in Poll Everywhere. But if one did show up in the chat, one or two, we'll try to get to those as well. All right, Dr. Stover, how are they doing?
Okay, this group is just amazingly informed. Most people, when I give these lectures, say, "True, yes, you can just use any PROs because they're out there and that's what it is." And this group knows that that is false. So very impressed. I don't normally get this level of informed people. So if you want to go to the next slide. So in fact, not all PROs are free. In most cases, you're going to be okay. But there are proprietary PROs out there that you need to either register or register and pay for. So these are some examples of PROs that I've seen as a problem in the last few years for at UNC. So the Beck depression inventory needs to be purchased. Brief pain inventory also needs purchased. EQ5D is just 5 questions, but it needs to be registered with the URAQUAL group. SF12 and SF36 is very common. Those need to be purchased. And Muriski medication adherence scale. People at researchers at UNC, I've seen at least one letter come from most of these folks, especially during economic downturns, we see more of this, where they start searching journal articles and saying, well, you use the SF-12 in your paper, but we don't see that you invoiced it. And this would also be a huge problem for clinics if you used a PRO that is actually proprietary. So your, friendly neighborhood PRO person can help you figure out which are okay to use. Next slide. So, I just told you about the bad, so here's the good. Promise is free to use. You can use it in clinics. It's available in EPIC editions 2017 and later. Promise stands for Pro Measurement Information System. So the National Institute of Health made about $100 million investment to develop scales that cut across health conditions. And it's about every symptom you can imagine, and there's validity and reliability evidence out there. We were developing these between 2004 and 2010. So there's quite a large literature now, but I put the address there in case you want to check out Promise, which is free. Next slide. So, I wanted to spend the last couple minutes just talking about the PRO rollout at the North Carolina Cancer Hospital. And, UNC Health is making an investment in PROs for, all the reasons I've outlined in this talk. And this is being led by Dr. Arlene Chung and Allison Swanley as a practice coach. So they're the two that are spearheading this initiative. So there's broad organizational support, and they've developed a governance process. And what they found is, that EPIC needed new functionalities. So we needed HIPAA-compliant, secure-based ePRO collection tablets, visualizations, and decision support for clinicians. Next slide. And then, they've developed somewhat of a process for a rollout at a clinic. Just giving people PROs and setting them loose, is not a good way to roll out a process. But there's a library of PROs in EPIC, and then there's a workflow assessment. So every clinic has been different. So Allison Swanley and Kinsey Brady go out to the clinics and help them try to figure out where do the PROs fit in. Who's going to actually hand the tablet to the patient, and how do they get that back? And then who's going to talk to them? So workflow is a major player. And then, ISD completes a build in EPIC if it's not already there. There are tip sheets. There's decision support available for clinicians. And then they go out and they train clinics to use the PROs and how to talk to them, how to talk to patients about those scores. Because we learned that that's really critical, that someone has to talk to them. And then they run PDSA cycles, and then the coaches send monthly reports to the clinic about how they're doing. In the implementation world, we call that audit and feedback. So it's the percent of PROs that they're completing for all the appropriate people that should have gotten one. And then I was trying to come up with a graphic for coaches, and didn't get anything I liked until I saw the women's basketball coach for UNC. So she's our representative coach for this slide. Next slide. So this slide is credited to Dr. Chung and Allison Swanley. This is their EPIC at UNC MyChart workflow. So you can see on the left that you have to assign the PRO to the patient, right? Right now they're automatically assigned when clinics go live. This particular poor patient looks like he's had a head injury. I'm guessing pain PROs are going to be appropriate here. And then what happens is, there are 3 ways that these PROs can get filled out. So they can use My UNC chart, so they can fill it out a few days at home before the appointment. They can use Welcome or e-check-in, I think we only have one clinic that uses a kiosk. The rest are front desk. And then there's EPIC Hyperspace, where a care team member could help the person fill that out if there were literacy issues or some other issue. And then, the third step is this symptom review for viewing. Provider reviews the PRO responses with the patient. Next slide. So I'm going to be doing some of the evaluation work, hopefully for the UNC rollout. So I'm looking forward to that data in the future. We were supposed to go live with cancer care for urology oncology in March, and COVID-19 had other ideas. So it's not safe to administer tablets to people when we could be, throwing germs around. So hopefully that's going to be up and coming whenever this nightmare is over. They are already live in one primary care, although I think they suspended in that clinic as well, just till we get through this COVID-19. But, just a couple take-home messages to leave you with. So in cancer care, PROs can improve communication about symptoms, symptom burden, survival, emergency room rates, satisfaction with care. But improved care doesn't happen automatically. Just giving someone a questionnaire is not going to help anybody. It has to be part of a communication process. And then, clinics need training to interpret and discuss those. It wouldn't be fair to roll something out without training folks. And then, I highly recommend getting pro help and implementation help if you're considering this for your clinic. Next slide. And next slide. I think it's just the question slide. Yeah, there we go. And it looks like we have about 6 or 7 minutes for questions.
All right, well, whoops, my mouse is a little bit jumpy today. Sorry about that. We'll go to our questions here. Let's see if that poll will populate. Looks like it's having a little bit of trouble there, and I'm not sure why. In any event, please go ahead and submit your questions. There we go. It is populating now, or at least showing. And then if you'll submit your questions via Poll Everywhere, we'll go ahead and share as many of those as possible. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I'll ask one, which is you mentioned about the tablet issue with COVID-19. Are there other specific challenges or specific opportunities associated with working with PROs with cancer patients in the age of COVID-19?
Yes, so I've seen a lot of health systems that have had to pivot to telehealth also want to use PROs. So, that could be an adjunct to, you would know the person's symptoms and their symptom burden before your telehealth call with that patient. And then for more, complex like cancer care, they could be filling these out, weekly at home if it made sense for that kind of cancer and treatment type. But the technology needs to be there, so that's the limitation.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. All right, and then we have a question from one of our audience members. How can we account for the intervention possibly accounting for improved outcomes, not just the clinician's responses to the patient's needs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's why we use the randomized clinicians' responses to usual care versus the intervention with the PROs, and we can directly compare those. And then what randomization does is makes those groups comparable. So hopefully that answers the question.
Great, thank you. And then we have another one should pop up here in just a moment, but in case it doesn't, well, let's see if we can get that up on the board. I'll read it from here until it shows up. And that is, what do you feel the greatest advantage to using PROs is in oncology? So there we go, it showed up. But if there's one single greatest advantage, what would that be?
I think it's the enhanced patient-centered care. Patients, universally, no matter what country we're talking about, like filling these out. They're interested in their own progress, their own symptoms, and they want to be able to talk to clinicians better and in a more informed way. So I think it's the patient-centered care.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. All right, here's another one. This one's probably for me. Will this presentation be available to others who were not able to attend today? Absolutely. Great question. It will be available in our library, so anyone can just go and watch it. Or if you want to receive credit for it, you can go ahead to our learn.unccn.org, and in just a few weeks that will be available for credit. And so for the next year, anyone who goes there will be able to receive the appropriate types of credit as well. And we've got another, oh, they just keep coming in. This is great. Is there an ePRO collection tool that could use chatbots? Interesting question.
Very interesting question. Yeah, Dr. Arlene Chung is actually working on that. So she designed a chatbot for COVID-19 symptoms that people attending UNC Health Care can use. But yes, ePROs could definitely be done this way. Another thing that is maybe on the horizon is using Alexa. So, assuming we could get over confidentiality reasons and things like that, Alexa could ask these questions and then send them in if we could figure out, the programming behind that. And then that might take the place of like an interactive voice response system if we could do that. And that might help folks, with literacy issues because we could offer it in a different language, et cetera, et cetera. So that's maybe one thing on the horizon too that I think could be pretty exciting.
Wow, that's very exciting, yeah. And then have you found that patients like to see their scores in a graph, or do they prefer hearing from the provider how they are doing?
Yeah, there was a big study done by Johns Hopkins about this, and it was both. So they want to be able to discuss it, but if it's in a graph that is in, that makes an intuitive sense. If it's a graph that nobody can comprehend, they don't want to see it, right? Nobody wants that. But if it's in a really simple format and it can be explained, like whether their symptoms are going up or going down, and how that they're doing and how they're doing in relation to other people, that patients really like those. And they also are very open to just hearing from the provider how they're doing. Like if, simple graphs aren't available, but they're just happy to hear about that.
Gotcha. Thank you. We'll take just a couple of more questions. Here's one for the IVR versus email collection choices by patients. Did you see that there were other contributing demographics to their preference for either collection methodology, age, gender, et cetera?
Yes, good question. So the interactive voice response group was more likely to be our at-risk population. So they were older, they didn't have a college degree, they might live in a rural area, which is probably a proxy for having access to internet, possibly income as well. We didn't look at the interaction between those yet because we just got our 3-month data in from patients because this is an ongoing trial. So we're going to look at those and see, when you put them all together in the model, what still hangs in there. And I suspect age is going to hang in there no matter what. But some of these other ones might not. So, but stay tuned.
Okay, sounds good. And Dr. Stover, last question for today. Have patient-reported outcomes been correlated with any kind of functional improvement in care management, such as medication adherence?
There is a medication adherence literature where they've looked at PROs and MEMS caps, which are prescription bottles that are digitally programmed so that when it's opened, you know that the bottle's been opened, but of course you don't actually know if the person took their medication or not. There is some work in that. I don't know that literature as well, but I suspect maybe it could help adherence if people are more engaged with how they're doing over time. But medication adherence is also really complex because there's a lot of things going into it, like being able to afford medication and that kind of thing that PROs wouldn't be able to help. So I'd imagine if you're using medication adherence as an intervention with PROs, you would need to consider other things as well.
Sure.
And then for functional improvement, there are tons of studies showing correlations between PROs and functional improvement. Usually it's in interventions, like for physical activity and sedentary behavior interventions. There's a whole literature for that. But just filling out the PROs, is that related to functional improvement? maybe if you can improve someone's pain, for instance, they can move better, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my dad had a knee replacement surgery, and he was walking like a very old man. And, you know, so if he had filled out pros about his pain, they would have been sky high before his surgery. But he did improve remarkably after the surgery, and he didn't have any more pain. So I'd
Good.
imagine there is a correlation.
Good. All right. Well, thank you so much. Let's take a look. We've got just my mouse just jumping all over the place today. A few things to finish up. We want to say thank you. Thank you to the North Carolina General Assembly for their generous support of the University Cancer Research Fund and the UNC Lineberger Comprehensive Cancer Center. We want to thank Mary King, Veneranda Obore, John Powell for all the hard work they do for each of these lectures. We also want to remind you can find us unccn@unc.edu is our email. You can call us. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. We're on YouTube. And we're on the web. And that's kind of the easiest place to find us. And that's just unccn.org. So thank you all so much.